O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So you can all see my mess.
It's looking more like a study and less like a transient space.
Yeah, there's fewer boxes.
Yeah, well, actually, most of the shelves are up, and so a lot of stuff, not all of the shelves and not everything is in place, but it's looking and feeling much better. So I'm very pleased with that. So next week, we won't have class. We've got a vigil for Annunciation. So that we should all celebrate that appropriately. So.
And after that, Vladika, it seems like there's 2 weeks before Holy Week. Do you think you'll have classes for those 2, or you're not sure yet?
I think probably, yeah. Not during Holy Week or Bright Week, of course.
Right.
Of course, Bright Week, it'd be great to have you all come down.
That would be good.
Yeah. I would, have a barbecue or something like that. And by that time, it'll be late enough that it won't even be dark by the time we finish dinner. So, all right, I think we start with the 3rd century, number 26. So what do I want to read through that? Or start reading?
I can have a go.
Go for it.
26. All beings endowed with intelligence and intellect are either angelic or human. All angelic beings may be subdivided further into 2 general moral categories or classes, the holy and the accursed. That is, the holy powers and the impure demons. All human beings may also be divided into 2 moral categories only, the godly and the ungodly. 27. Since God is absolute existence, absolute goodness, and absolute wisdom, or rather, to put it more exactly, since God is beyond all such things, there is nothing whatsoever that is opposite to him. Creatures, on the other hand, all exist through participation and grace, while those endowed with intelligence and intellect also have a capacity for goodness and wisdom. Hence, they do not have opposites. As the opposites of existence, they have non-existence. And as the opposites to the capacity for goodness and wisdom, they have evil and ignorance. Whether or not they are to exist eternally lies within the power of their maker. But whether or not intelligent creatures are to participate in his goodness and wisdom depends on their own will. "28. The ancient Greek philosophers say that the being of created things has coexisted with God from all eternity, and that God has only given it its qualities. They say that this being itself has no opposite, and that opposition lies only in the qualities. But But we maintain that only the divine essence has no opposite, since it is eternal and infinite and bestows eternity on other things. The being of created things, on the other hand, has non-being as its opposite. Whether or not it exists eternally depends on the power of him who alone exists in a substantive sense. But since the gifts of God are irrevocable, Romans 11:29, the being of created things always is and always will be sustained by his almighty power, even though it has, as we have said, an opposite. For it has been brought into being from non-being, and whether or not it exists depends on the will of God.
Okay, I mean, essentially what he's, obviously what he's talking about is the nature of first of things that exist, but then also noetic beings and human beings, noetic or angelic beings, which can be either angels or demons, and human beings who are either good or evil, who are either seeking after wisdom and goodness, or who seek after evil and ultimately non-existence. I think it's a really important thing to note that while it is God who decides on the continuity of non-rational beings, intelligent beings, in other words, beings endowed with noetic faculties, which are created to participate in goodness and wisdom, it depends on their own will as to whether they choose salvation or reject it. It's a very different kind of, it's a very different emphasis than the idea that God is waiting, that God is going to judge us and condemn us to hell. Rather, the whole idea is that our salvation depends on our own choice, whether we choose to live in pursuit of the goodness and the wisdom, in other words, in accordance and to seek the will of God and to live in synergy with God, or we choose not to. I don't know if that makes sense. Yes, no?
Yes. Yeah.
The ancient Greeks did not have the idea that God was the creator. They believed that the gods arranged matter, not that they created it. Of course, in the Hebrew and Christian traditions, we believe that God created matter out of nothing, and He endowed noetic beings with the ability to ultimately to choose or reject salvation. So, for
does the Greek view imply that God, the Greek view of God, that He makes good and bestows good and evil qualities?
It's whether the creature seeks the good and evil qualities. The image of God within man is the potential to do good and to see and to attain to wisdom. It's inborn, it's innate, as part of the fundamental definition of human nature, to be able to seek goodness and wisdom. And that, as later gets developed, that that is the nature of the image of God within man. And then the likeness has to be attained by the seeking of goodness and wisdom. In other words, by choosing goodness and wisdom, we attain to that state of, it's a choice of eternal life. God has given us this gift. Do we choose? In other words, do we choose to accept it? So, anyone else, or shall we move on? '29.
Just as evil is a privation of good, and ignorance of privation of knowledge, so non-being is a privation of being, not of being in a substantive sense, for that does not have an opposite, but of being that exists by participation in substantive being. The first two privations mentioned depend on the will of the creatures. The third lies in the will of the Maker, who in his goodness wills being always to exist and always to receive his blessings. 30. All creatures are either endowed with intelligence and intellect, and thus possess a capacity for opposites such as virtue and vice, knowledge and ignorance, or else they are physical bodies of various kinds made up of opposites, that is, of earth, air, fire, and water. The former are altogether incorporeal and immaterial, although some of them are joined to bodies. The latter are composed of matter and form. By nature, all bodies lack a capacity for motion. They are given motion by the soul, either one that is intelligent or by one without intelligence, but by one that is insensate, as the case may be, or by one that is insensate, as the case may be. The soul has three powers. First, the power of nourishment and growth. Second, that of imagination and instinct. Third, that of intelligence and intellect. Plants share only in the first of these powers. Animals share in the first and the second. Men share in all three. The first two powers are perishable. The third is clearly imperishable and immortal. 33. In communicating illumination to each other, the angelic powers also communicate either their virtue or their knowledge to human nature. As regards their virtue, they communicate a goodness which imitates the goodness of God, and through this goodness they confer blessings on themselves, on one another, and on their inferiors, thus making them like God. As regards their knowledge, they communicate either a more sublime knowledge of God, for as Scripture says, Thou, Lord, art most high forevermore, or a more profound knowledge about embodied beings, or one that is more exact about incorporeal beings, or more distinct about divine providence, or more precise about divine judgment. I'm a little bit lost, but he's talking about angels, is he, Vladika?
Yeah, he is.
34. Impurity of intellect consists first in having false knowledge, second in being ignorant of the universals. I refer to the human intellect, for it is a property of the angelic intellect not to be ignorant even of particulars. Thirdly, in having impassioned thoughts. And fourthly, in assenting to sin. Vladika, what does it mean to have false knowledge?
Well, I would think that that would be something like believing in mythology or believing, heresies and things like that.
Okay. And ignorance, I think we touched on that before. Is ignorance something that comes by virtue of sin? I mean, a lot of people are very disconnected from Christian witness in different places in the world. Is that which ignorance can be overcome by the preaching of the gospel, but is he referring to that, or do we become ignorant by virtue of pushing God away from ourselves?
Well, depends on, ignorance is a technical term in this kind of literature, and it means lack of awareness of God.
Okay.
Losing awareness of God. It has nothing to do with rational facts. But it's a kind of on one hand, it's a non-recognition of God. But it's also lack of perception of God. So I think, in a sense, so for impurity of intellect consisting in false knowledge would be a lack of perception of God, or refusal to perceive God, refusal to acknowledge his presence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to as universals. And this obviously impassioned thoughts in assenting to sin, that's clear. But some of this other is a little bit, esoteric.
Okay, I'll proceed on. 35. Impurity of soul lies in its not functioning in accordance with nature. It is because of this that impassioned thoughts are produced in the intellect. The soul functions in accordance with nature when its passible aspects, that is, its insensitive power and its desire, remain dispassionate in the face of provocations, both from things and from the conceptual images of things. 36. Impurity of body consists in actual committing of sin. 37. He who is not attracted by worldly things cherishes stillness. He who loves nothing merely human loves all men. And he who takes no offense at anything, either on account of their faults or on account of his own suspicious thoughts, has knowledge of God and of things divine. It is a great achievement not to be attracted by things, but it is a far greater achievement to remain dispassionate in the face of both things and the conceptual images we derive from them. Love and self-control keep the intellect dispassionate in the face of both things and the conceptual images we form of them. The intellect of a man who enjoys the love of God does not fight against things or against conceptual images of things. It battles against the passions which are linked with the images. It does not, for example, fight against a woman or against a man who has offended it, or even against the images it forms of them, but it fights against the passions which are linked with the images. The whole purpose of the monk's warfare against the demons is to separate the passions from conceptual images. Otherwise, he will not be able to look on things dispassionately.
Does everybody understand what he's talking about? No? Yes, no.
If you decide to explain it, that would be great.
Okay. Okay. Warfare against the demons. Most of spiritual life is about spiritual warfare, and the demons attack us through our thoughts, and the thoughts consist of conceptual images. It may be words, it may be actual images, it may be memories, it may be imaginations, it may be all of these various things, and when we have a habitual reaction to a certain image or thought, that habitual action can become a passion. In other words, it kind of short circuits the whole process of confronting these thoughts and images, and we just automatically react in a certain way. So the purpose of our warfare against the demons is to separate the passion from the image. In other words, so that the image might pop into our mind or go across our sight of vision or something like that, but we don't react to it. And the goal in this spiritual process is dispassion, which doesn't mean to be apathetic, even though the word, it's kind of a false cognate with the Greek word apatheia. But what it means, what dispassion means, is ultimately self-control. And so that we can control how we act, and we can control our mind, so that we can even deal with images that perhaps once would incite us to some kind of passionate reaction. Does it make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Like we're retraining ourselves.
Exactly. That's it, exactly.
"42. A thing, a conceptual image, and a passion are all quite different from one another. For example, a man, a woman, gold, and so forth are things. A conceptual image is a passion-free thought of one of these things. A passion is a mindless affection or indiscriminate hatred for one of these same things. The monk's battle is therefore against passion." So that word mindless, that would be what you are saying then, that it's a short circuit, it's not
Right. It's not a considered reaction.
right.
It's rather a kind of what we in our culture advocate as or extol as spontaneity. In other words, an almost an unthinking, unreasoned, automatic response. The example that I use when I give lectures to this is, say you love McDonald's hamburgers, and the ad comes on for a McDonald's hamburger. And all of a sudden, before you even think about it, you're jumping in the car and you're racing down the road to McDonald's. And you can taste that hamburger. You can feel it slipping down your throat. It feels so good. It tastes so good, you know, and it doesn't matter that it's Friday during Lent, you know. That's a spontaneous, passionate, habitual reaction. We all know about all the others. You know, say somebody who's hurt you in the past, and you come across them, and you basically want to punch them out, you know. And so you have, and just the mention of their name brings up this wrath in you that you just want to take them out. That is a passion. That's an impassioned thought. And so it's very important to learn how to say no to those impassioned thoughts. Otherwise, we're going to end up in jail or something, you know. And so the idea is to separate the passion from the thought. And you know that you've achieved that, at least in relation to that one thought, when, for example, that person who you've spent years and years resenting comes up and there's no reaction. There's no emotional reaction. It's just like, oh, okay, that's that person. We had our problems in the past, and that's it. Which is much better than punching them out. So.
Okay, 43. An impassioned conceptual image is a thought compounded of passion and a conceptual image. If we separate the passion from the conceptual image, what remains is the passion-free thought. We can make this separation by means of spiritual love and self-control, if only we have the will. The virtues separate the intellect from the passions. Spiritual contemplation separates it from its passion-free conceptual images of things. Pure prayer brings it into the presence of God itself.
Okay. So this is important. These are three kind of layers, three levels. The virtues separate the intellect, the mind, from the passions. In other words, if we practice the virtues, we're going to have more control over our passions. When we enter into the practice of spiritual contemplation, of contemplative prayer, it separates. We enter into deep stillness, and so we learn how to let the thoughts and the images just go by, and not engage them, so that we're not even distracted by them. The third level is pure prayer, which is a state of being in deep, wordless, imageless union with God. And it becomes the experience of God Himself. Pure prayer, state of pure prayer is a gift of grace.
45. The virtues exist for the sake of the knowledge of creatures. Knowledge for the sake of the knower for the sake of him who is known through unknowing, and who knows beyond all knowledge. Oh, that's quite a tongue twister.
This is very Dionysian. Like probably he may have lifted this from Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. That's how he writes. In order to, in other words, in order to authentically know what created beings are, we can only approach that in the context of the virtues. And knowledge exists, and knowledge is there for the sake of the knower. In other words, knowledge has meaning because somebody wants to know it. The knower, in other words, the person who seeks God, because this knowledge that he's talking about is all about the knowledge of God, not about God. It's the knowledge of God. Knowledge, the knower exists for the sake of him who is known through unknowing. In other words, the one who seeks God exists for the sake of God who is unknowable, and who himself knows beyond all knowledge. In other words, he is the summation of all knowledge. Now, if you translate some of this into Greek, or retranslate it, virtues exist for the sake of the gnosis of creatures. Gnosis for the sake of the Gnostic for the sake of him who is known ognostikos through agnosia, and who knows beyond all knowledge. And this, in other words, what he's talking about and what he's addressing in this is the ancient debate about Christian gnosis. And the gnosis of, for a Christian, that which is known is God, but the knowledge of, it's not objective knowledge. It's this radically personal awareness. It's a gnosis as opposed to some kind of objective empirical knowledge. In other words, it's not about knowing about God. It's about knowing God. And when we know God, it's not that we know him, it's that he knows us.
Well, Dika, what you're saying is it equivalent to, say, the experience of God?
Yes.
Experiencing Christ, experiencing God.
Yep.
Okay.
So shall we go on?
46. God, full beyond all fullness, brought creatures into being not because he had need of anything, but so that they might participate in him in proportion to their capacity, and that he himself might rejoice in his works, Psalm 104. Through seeing them joyful and ever filled to overflowing with his inexhaustible gifts.
I think this is incredibly beautiful. chapter. Think about it, that God created all things that he might rejoice in them and that they might rejoice in him. What an incredibly beautiful thing.
Mm.
So, Adika, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm trying to connect dots here. So, the knowledge of God, or as we agreed, is similar to the experience of God.
Yep.
So, if you backtrack where we talked about ignorance, we could say, well, I don't know God because I never experienced him. But we could be ignorant because we may have experienced it and not know it. Does that make sense?
Well, in a sense, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think the real point is that God calls us to knowledge. God is calling us to know himself. He wants us to know him and to rejoice in him. And that's why he created us in the first place.
So I liken this to when we leave liturgy on Sunday and we're very uplifted and very lighthearted and we've experienced Christ.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
"47. There are many people in the world who are poor in spirit, but not in the way that they should be. There are many who mourn, but for some financial loss or the death of their children. Many are gentle, but toward unclean passions. Many hunger and thirst, but only to seize what does not belong to them and to profit from injustice. Many are merciful, but towards their bodies and the things that serve the body. Many are pure in heart, but for the sake of self-esteem. Many are peacemakers, but by making the soul submit to the flesh. Many are persecuted, but as wrongdoers. Many are reviled, but for shameful sins. Only those are blessed who do or suffer these things for the sake of Christ and after his example. Why? Because theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and they shall see God. It is not because they do or suffer these things that they are blessed, for those whom we have spoken above do the same. It is because they do them and suffer them for the sake of Christ and after his example. "48. As has been said many times, in everything we do, God examines our motive to see whether we are doing it for his sake, or for some other purpose. Thus, when we desire to do something good, we should not do it for the sake of popularity. We should have God as our goal, so that with our gaze always fixed on him, we may do everything for his sake. Otherwise, we shall undergo all the trouble of performing the act and yet lose the reward." "49. In time of prayer, clear your intellect of both the passion-free conceptual images of human things and the contemplation of creatures. Otherwise, in imagining these lesser things, you may fall away from him who is incomparably greater than all created beings. Through genuine love of God, we can drive out the passions. Love for God is this: to choose him rather than the world, and the soul rather than the flesh, by despising the things of this world and by devoting ourselves constantly to him through self-control, love, prayer, psalmody, and so on. 51. If we persistently devote ourselves to God and keep a careful watch on the soul's passible aspect, we are no longer driven headlong by the provocations of our thoughts. On the contrary, as we acquire a more exact understanding of their causes and cut them off, we become more discerning. In this way, the following words come to apply to us. My eye also sees my enemies, and my ear shall hear the wicked that rise up against me. Psalm 92:11. 52. When you see that your intellect reflects upon its conceptual images of the world with reverence and justice, you may be sure that your body too continues to be pure and sinless. But when you see that your intellect is occupied with thoughts of sin, and you do not check it, you may be sure that before very long your body too will fall into those sins. 53. As the world of the body consists of things, so the world of the intellect consists of conceptual images. And as the body fornicates with the body of a woman, so the intellect, forming a picture of his own body, fornicates with the conceptual image of a woman. For in the mind it sees the form of its own body having intercourse with the form of a woman. Similarly, through the form of its own body, it mentally attacks the form of someone who has given it offense. The same is true with respect to other sins. For what the body acts out in the world of things, the intellect also acts out in the world of conceptual images. 54. One should not be startled or astonished because God the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. John 5:22. The Son teaches us, do not judge so that you may not be judged. Matthew 7:1. Do not condemn so that you may not be condemned. Luke 6:37. St. Paul likewise says, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes. 1 Corinthians 4:5. And by judging another, you condemn yourself. Romans 2:1. But men have given up weeping for their own sins and have taken judgment away from the Son. They themselves judge and condemn one another as if they were sinless. Heaven was amazed at this, from Jeremiah 2:12, and the earth shuddered, but men in their obduracity are not ashamed. I've never read that word before.
Obduracy?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Stubbornness, basically.
Okay.
Shall
I keep going?
Kind of like ignorance, stubbornness and ignorance.
Okay. Okay. Number 55. He who busies himself with the sins of others or judges his brother on suspicion has not yet begun to repent or to examine himself so as to discover his own sins, which are truly heavier than a great lump of lead. Nor does he know why a man becomes heavy-hearted when he loves vanity and chases after falsehood, from Psalm 4:1. That is why, like a fool who walks in the darkness, he no longer attends to his own sins, but lets his imagination dwell on the sins of others. whether these sins are real or merely the product of his own suspicious mind.
It's really important not to judge others. This is, I think, this is a constant theme. That if we judge others, it's because we haven't even begun to repent or examine ourselves. Because if we had, then we would never judge others.
What does that middle phrase mean? Nor does he know why a man becomes heavy-hearted when he loves vanity and chases after falsehood.
Well, because partly because I would say that he becomes oblivious really to the other. He loses empathy for him, and nor would he understand. He himself loves vanity and chases after falsehood, and doesn't realize that that he himself has lost his communion with God. I would think. So the next line is explanatory. That is why, like a fool who walks in darkness, he no longer attends to his own sins, but lets his imagination dwell on the sins of others, whether these sins are real or merely the products of his own suspicious mind. In other words, what he's talking about is a state of delusion. So, does it make sense?
Yes,
So-
it does, and it's.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if a person is fixed on somebody else's sins, or so he thinks he's seeing other people sin, but really that other person could not be sinning, is that what it's saying? He's just imagining it.
Well, you might just be imagining it.
Okay.
But
That's right. He could be, yeah.
yeah, because he lacked, if the person who is busy, who is so preoccupied with judging others, is completely unable to see his own sins, and otherwise he wouldn't judge others.
Right.
If he judged others, he would see it. If he did not judge others, he could begin to see his own sins.
Judging others is taking over Christ's role, which we're not competent to do.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But presumably this is also completely different from the whole concept of having no moral compass at all, so not feeling anything's okay, and that the idea of judgment at all is completely wrong. I'm sort of alluding to
Contemporary
yes.
reality. And yet, is there anybody more judgmental than somebody who thinks that thinks that they're constantly being judged and condemns Christians as those who are bitterly judgmental, who themselves think that they have that they are without, they have no, that they don't judge anyone. In other words, they're blinded.
It mentions up in the previous chapter that I think it quotes St. Paul saying, judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes. And I think at one point Paul says, I do not even judge myself.
Uh-huh.
But he obviously is not referring, you know, you've made it very clear we should, in a sense, judge ourselves. We should look at our own sins, and therefore we won't be led to, you know, to focus on other people's sins, so or what we perceive as their sins. So we should judge ourselves, right? We should, but maybe Paul was meaning something different when he said he didn't judge himself.
Well, I think what he's talking about is condemn.
Okay.
Then there's a difference between discerning sin, in that sense of judgment, which is totally different than condemning. We need to discern our own sins. And sometimes you can see that another person is sinning, it's just obvious. But if you can see that they're sinning but not condemn them, then that's like a dispassionate recognition of simply a reality. So, but the point is to not judge and condemn others, but to be mindful of our own sins. So, shall we move on, or is there more?
Okay. Number 56. Self-love, as has often been said, is the cause of all impassioned thoughts, for from it are produced the three principal thoughts of desire, those of gluttony, avarice, and self-esteem, or vainglory. From gluttony is born the thought of unchastity, from avarice the thought of greed, from self-esteem the thought of pride. All the rest, the thoughts of anger, resentment, rancor, listlessness, envy, backbiting, and so on, are consequent upon one or other of these three. These passions then tie the intellect to material things and drag it down to earth, pressing on it like a massive stone, although by nature it is lighter and swifter than fire. "57. The origin of all the passions is self-love. Their consummation is pride. Self-love is a mindless love for the body. He who cuts this off, cuts off at the same time all the passions that come from it." "58. Just as parents have a special affection for their children, who are the fruit of their own bodies, so the intellect naturally clings to its own thoughts. And just as to passionately fond parents, their own children seem to be most capable and beautiful of all, though they may be quite the most ridiculous in every way, so to a foolish intellect, its own thoughts appear the most intelligent of all, though they may be utterly degraded. The wise man does not regard his own thoughts in this way. It is precisely when he feels convinced that they are true and good that he most distrusts his own judgment. He makes other wise men the judges of his thoughts and arguments, lest he should run or may have run in vain, and from them receives assurance. Okay, 59. When you overcome one of the grosser passions, such as gluttony, unchastity, anger, or greed, the thought of self-esteem at once assails you. If you defeat this thought, the thought of pride succeeds it. All of the gross passions that dominate the soul drive from it the thought of self-esteem. But when all these passions have been defeated, they leave self-esteem free to take control.
Vladika,
Yes.
that I got lost on that one.
Okay.
Talking
Number
about
60.
self-esteem.
Okay. All the gross passions that dominate the soul. In other words, gluttony, lust, anger, avarice, drive from it the thought of self-esteem. In other words, it's actually what the word here is vainglory, kenodoxia. In other words, it's hard to be vainglorious when you're falling flat on your face and you struggle with the passions. But when these passions have been defeated, in other words, when we no longer allow ourselves to fall prey to those passions, then vainglory steps in. Regardless of whether we defeat it or not, pride arises. In other words, even if we defeat all of these external, these kind of physical passions, the grosser passions, pride is going to come out. Pride is going to come out of that self-esteem. And if that pride is eradicated, there's still the danger of conceit, which is just another more subtle form of pride. But the danger, on the other hand, is boastfulness. Well, look at me, here I am. I overcame the demon of unchastity. I overcame the demon of gluttony and lost 500 pounds or 300 or whatever, boastfulness, right? So we have to be, it's all about, so this is all about looking at that, this process, the psychological process of how we deal with the passions and what are the dangers as we go along the path. Because the goal is to overcome them all.
Vladika, so could you exchange the word self-esteem for pride? They leave pride free to take control.
Well, it's actually vainglory is the actual word in the text.
Okay.
The Greek, yeah.
Because self-esteem, if you take one's self-esteem, complete self-esteem, that could lead to other issues, right?
Right. Of course, in America, there's a whole psychology built on self-esteem.
Right.
And so it's entered into our kind of common vocabulary. And I think it has this was translated in Britain in the 70s. Probably before that, a whole movement really became big in Britain, if it ever did. And so they're dealing with a different idiom.
Okay, so in this instance, self-esteem is not equivalent to how we refer to self-esteem in America.
No, it's,
Okay.
because in our sense, for us, there's a positive sense to self-esteem, which is important, on psychologically.
Right.
But what this is referring to is vainglory.
Okay. Makes more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, shall I continue?
Uh-huh.
I'm going to continue with 62.
Yes.
Self-esteem or vainglory is eradicated by the hidden practice of the virtues, pride by ascribing our achievements to God.
The emphasis on the hidden practice of the virtues.
So in other words, glory to God for all things.
Glory to God, yes, but glory to God for all things. That and you know, not taking credit for any of the ascetic achievements.
Right, because without him and without having through him, we can do. Without him, we can do nothing.
Right,
Correct.
exactly.
Right. Okay.
'63. He who has been granted knowledge of God and fully enjoys the pleasure that comes with it, despises all the pleasures produced by the soul's desiring power. He who desires earthly things desires either food or things which satisfy his sexual appetite, or human fame or wealth, or some other thing consequent upon these. Unless the intellect finds something more noble to which it may transfer its desire, it will not be persuaded to scorn these things completely. The knowledge of God and of divine things is incomparably more noble than these earthly things. Those who scorn sensual pleasures do so either from fear or from hope or from knowledge and love for God. 66. Passion-free knowledge of divine things does not persuade the intellect to scorn material things completely. It is like the passion-free thoughts of a sensible thing. It is therefore possible to find many men who have much knowledge and yet wallow in the passions of the flesh, like pigs in the mire. Through their diligence, they temporarily cleanse themselves and obtain knowledge, but then they grow negligent. In this, they resemble Saul, for Saul was granted the kingdom, but conducted himself unworthily and was driven out with terrible wrath. 1 Samuel 10 through 15. So can you explain this, Vladika? It seems like it's possible to go part of the way but not really have made true progress and be fooling ourselves. Is that what it's implying? Or
I think ultimately what it implies is there has to be more than simply dispassionate knowledge. It has to go beyond that. Passion-free knowledge of divine things. In other words, passion-free knowledge of divine things does not persuade the intellect to scorn material things completely. I think he's referring to theological ideas here. He says it's like the passion-free thought of a sensible thing. In other words, theological knowledge is like any other kind of thought. And you can have a lot of knowledge about theology, and yet still indulge in the passions of the flesh.
Okay.
And so through diligence, they might temporarily cleanse themselves and attain knowledge. In other words, for a while they'll focus and they'll refrain from, they'll fast a little bit, and they'll stay away from the things that gratify the flesh. But then they'll return to it. They grow negligent.
So by having no passion, we may experience Christ, and that would persuade us to want to experience it more.
Well, I mean,
keep the passions in check.
Well, the goal of keeping the passions in check, in other words, to not have uncontrolled reactions to external events, or to thoughts, or to conceptual images, means that means that we're able to focus and keep our focus on Christ, and keep the awareness of Christ.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So
that helps. Thank you.
Okay.
Number 67.
Uh-huh.
Just as passion-free thought of human things does not compel the intellect to scorn divine things, so passion-free knowledge of divine things does not fully persuade it to scorn human things. For in this world, truth exists in shadows and conjectures. That is why there is need for the blessed. That is why there is need for the blessed passion of holy love, which binds the intellect to spiritual contemplation and persuades it to prefer what is immaterial to what is material, and what is intelligible and divine to what is apprehended by the senses. If a man has cut off the passions and so has freed his thoughts from passion, it does not necessarily mean that his thoughts are already orientated toward the divine. It may be that he feels no passionate attraction either for human or divine things. This occurs in the case of those simply living the life of ascetic practice without yet having been granted spiritual knowledge. Such men keep the passions at bay either by fear of punishment or by hope of the kingdom.
Let's look at that one again. If a man has cut off the passions and so has freed his thoughts from passion, it does not necessarily mean that his thoughts are already oriented towards the divine. In other words, you can be dispassionate in a non-spiritual way. It simply means you have great self-control. In other words, without noetic understanding. And so in that, one can be totally detached. In other words, feeling no passionate attachment for humans or for divine things. And this happens when people who simply live the life of ascetic practice without yet having been granted spiritual knowledge. In other words, this, for example, is Buddhism. Buddhism is the goal of Buddhism is the attainment of dispassion and detachment, total detachment. But and there are those who, in practicing Buddhism, find themselves suddenly aware of God and called by Christ. But there are those who have no, but there are plenty of who go through all of the ascetic forms and who have no spiritual awareness. Because noetic awareness and rational awareness are two different things. And the rational awareness is the realm of is the field of the battle with the passions. But just because your rational awareness is controlled, it doesn't mean that your spiritual awareness has been enlightened or opened. Does it make sense?
Yes, but what does it mean? Such men keep passions at bay either by fear of punishment or by hope of the kingdom.
Well, I mean, there are those. Well, they fear. In other words, they cut off sin, and they cut off sinful attachment to their passions, either through fear of going to hell.
Oh.
Or by hoping that by doing these things they will attain to the kingdom of God.
Is that a bad thing, though?
No, but it kind of misses the
mark.
Yeah, it misses the mark.
Okay.
I think it's tied back to that previous one about holy love.
I was just thinking love. Without love, you have nothing.
Yeah, right.
Right, exactly.
So, Vladika, I'm wondering if that's, at the monastery, you're not only doing asceticism, but you're reading the scriptures all the time,
right,
and doing the services, so you're constantly being exposed to the love of Christ through the Gospels. Is that?
Yep.
Is that sort of an antidote to just only doing the ascetic part?
Yeah, it is, and because ultimately that just to engage in asceticism is not. The whole point is a living experience of communion with God. The goal of the ascetic life is the goal of monasticism is to be immersed in the love of God and to learn how to love selflessly with His love. And it's not simply to cut off our passionate thoughts and become dispassionate. That's a tool, but it's not the goal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a story about a monk from Mount Athos that this pilgrim goes and he encounters this monk, and the monk he's an older guy, and he's grumbling, and he says, "I've been at this 30 years and I still haven't attained to unceasing prayer." And the point is not so much is that the real goal. The real goal is communion with God. It's not the mechanics of it.
So one would think that if a monk or somebody obtains unceasing prayer, then they in fact have obtained communion with God.
Well,
Because
yeah,
without
yeah, they would with unceasing prayer would come communion with God.
right, because you wouldn't have it without that communion.
Right.
Okay.
But this monk is referring to it more as a more as an ascetic exercise
Right.
than the living experience. So, shall we move on?
69. We walk by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7. And we gain spiritual knowledge through symbols, indistinctly as in a mirror. 1 Corinthians 13:12. Thus we must devote much time to this kind of knowledge, so that by long study and constant application we may achieve a persistent state of contemplation. What are these symbols, Vladika, that he's talking about?
The symbols, well, the symbols are, I would say, are the conceptual ideas. In other words, doctrines and images and rituals and all of these things. You know, through the practice of through using all these external forms, because ultimately all the external forms are symbols. In fact, some of them are, some of them are sacraments, but by using all of these external forms, which are not as plain or not as clear, for example, as direct spiritual vision, but what they do is that they form our mind and help us to enter into a state of persistently contemplating, for example, the words of Christ in the Gospels, contemplating the writings of the fathers, contemplating, and what he's referring to here as contemplation is not the state of pure prayer contemplation, but rather of meditating on these things, on religious themes, essentially, and theology. So we gain spiritual knowledge through them. I don't know how else to explain it. So for example, in the ascent to contemplation, to contemplative prayer, one of the things that that's really important is, or in forming novices in a life of prayer, the first thing you do is you give them a prayer book. When a person first becomes Orthodox, one of the first things they should do is get a prayer book and start reading the prayers which teach the mind how to pray as the fathers prayed and using the words of the fathers. Eventually, we go beyond that, but we need these forms to conform ourselves to, so that we can gain that, so that we can kind of create a context for the higher level of spiritual knowledge, higher level of spiritual awareness, and be able to express what's going on. And unless we've been educated in these forms at first, how, and conform our mind to them, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say that a person has really entered into the tradition itself, right? Everybody, we need to understand how, not only how to be Orthodox, but how to talk Orthodox. How to live Orthodox. It's not just, and then this becomes the context for further spiritual growth. So shall we go to 75 and then we'll end it here for tonight?
Okay. Number 70. If we cut off the causes of the passions for only a short while and occupy ourselves with spiritual contemplation without making it our sole and constant concern, we easily revert to the passions of the flesh, gaining nothing from our labor but theoretical knowledge coupled with conceit. The result is a gradual darkening of this knowledge itself and a complete turning of the intellect toward material things.
Yep.
71. The passion of love, when reprehensible, occupies the intellect with material things, but when rightly directed, unites it with the divine. For the intellect tends to develop its powers among those things to which it devotes its attention, and where it develops its powers, there it will direct its desire and love. It will direct them, that is to say, either to what is divine, intelligible, and proper to its nature, or to the passions and things of the flesh. God created both the invisible and visible worlds, and he obviously also made both the soul and the body. If the visible world is so beautiful, what must the invisible world be like? And if the visible world is superior, and if the invisible world is superior to the visible world, how much superior to both is God their creator? If then the creator of everything that is beautiful is superior to all his creation, on what grounds does the intellect abandon what is superior to all and engross itself in what is worst of all? I mean, the passions of the flesh. Clearly, this happens because the intellect has lived with these passions and grown accustomed to them since birth, whereas it has not yet had perfect experience of him who is superior to all and beyond all things. Thus, if we gradually wean the intellect away from this relationship by long practice of controlling our indulgence in pleasure and by persistent meditation on divine realities, the intellect will gradually develop itself more and more to these realities. The intellect will gradually devote itself more and more to these realities and will recognize its own dignity and finally transfer all its desire to the divine. '73. He who speaks dispassionately of his brother's sins does so either to correct him or to benefit another. If he speaks for any other reason, either to his brother himself or to another person, he speaks to abuse him and ridicule him. In this case, he will not escape being abandoned by God. On the contrary, he will fall into the same sins or other sins, and censured and reproached by other men be put to shame.
This is a spiritual law, that if we judge somebody for something, we inevitably fall into it ourselves. That's a kind of absolute principle.
Okay, 74. It is not always for the same reason that sinners commit the same sin. The reasons vary. For example, it is one thing to sin through force of habit and another to sin through being carried away by a sudden impulse. In the latter case, the man did not deliberately choose the sin either before committing it or afterward. On the contrary, he is deeply distressed that the sin has occurred. It is quite different with a man who sins through force of habit. Prior to the act itself, he was already sinning in the thought, and after it, he is still in the same state of mind. And lastly, 75. He who cultivates the virtues for the sake of self-esteem also seeks after spiritual knowledge for the same reason. Such a man plainly does not do anything or discuss anything for the edification of others. On the contrary, he always seeks the praise of those who see him or hear him. His passion is brought to light when some of these people censure his actions or words. This distresses him greatly, not because he has failed to edify them, for this was not his aim, but because he has been humiliated.
So I think we'll end there for tonight. Or do you want to carry on? Want to go further?
That's an okay place to stop.
What's that? Good
That's a
place?
good place to stop.
Okay.
It's so rich, Wadika, we need to digest it.
Yep. So. Yeah, it's also this last one, 75, is also very important. You know, if we cultivate for the virtues or gain theological knowledge for the sake of you know, gratifying our ego, or for you know, some other source of vainglory, we're always going to end up being humiliated, because somebody's always going to call us on it. So, or they don't praise us enough or something like that. That's bad. So otherwise, I hope everybody is having a good Lent. We're this week we're going to at the monastery we have on Friday we're going to do the pre-sanctified a bit later in the afternoon. It'll be around 4:30 or thereabouts, Our choir director just got a new job, so I'm very pleased that he got a job. But that will keep him occupied. So that'll be good.
And this is at the monastery or the church?
Monastery. So at 4:30 on Friday afternoon, and then we have liturgy, of course, on Saturday morning at 10. Now this Saturday, a little earlier, we'll have the baptism of Andrew, who is he's a great kid. He just joined our brotherhood. He was in school down in Lynchburg, and was a catechumen down there for quite a while, and he wanted to come up and so we'll finish it off, finish off his catechesis, but he wants very much to be to join the brotherhood. So I'm very pleased that after that, eventually, in due time, we'll make him a postulant and then a novice. So
very good.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So it's okay to come to pre-sanctified on Friday?
Well, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. You know, our services are open.
Okay, very good.
So
I'm off this Friday, so that works.
Okay, yeah. So actually, at 4:30, we'll probably have 9th hour, and
Okay.
and then slide into the pre-sanctified a little bit later, at
Okay, very good.
around 5. So.
Thank you, Vladika.
All right. Very good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Okay.